All right. Good morning. It is Friday, April the 15th, and we're doing interviews for the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I am interviewing.
My name is Eldon Terrell, and I served in Vietnam from August of 1970 to September of 1971.
Okay, thank you. So, where were you born, Eldon?
I was born in Torrington, Wyoming, and then I was 2 weeks old, and my dad was a World War II veteran, and name was drawn to have a farm in northwest Nebraska that was opened up to veterans, and so we moved to a little town of Hay Springs, Nebraska, shortly after my birth, and that's where I spent a good part of my life. I graduated from high school there. I went to Chadron State College, graduated there, and then I was number 58 in the lottery in 1969. I was going to graduate in January, and the draft board told me that I was going to be probably drafted in March, so I enlisted 3 days after I graduated, was in the Army.
Okay, and once you went into the Army, what did your parents think about that?
Well, my dad being a World War II veteran, he understood the necessary of young men stepping up to be soldiers. My brother at the time was in Vietnam. He went in 1969. He spent 2 years and 3 months, and my folks really supported us. But I didn't realize till later, but we had a neighbor lady that was a good friend of my mother's, and just a couple years ago I had stopped to see her in Chadron, Nebraska, and she was in the nursing home, and she says, you know, your mother used to come over and cry on my shoulder that she was worried about her boys in Vietnam. And you know, I never realized the effect it had on parents, you know, having children serving in the military. And it definitely affected my mother some. So.
Well, it's nice she had that support.
Yeah.
So once you went into the Army, what course did you follow?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I went to basic at Fort Lewis, Washington in February, March of 1970. And at the end of basic training, they had a basic training unit in Fort Lewis, and they also had infantry advanced individual training at Fort Lewis. And when we got our orders of what we were going to do at the end of basic training, I was the only one in our unit that was not 11 Bravo, which was infantry. I was a 45 M20. I had no idea what it was. So I went to the orderly room, and they told me, well, you're going to be at aircraft armament repair school in Aberdeen, Maryland, which was clear across the United States. And everybody else in my unit was going to infantry training, and I saw guys cry when they got their orders because they knew that in 2 months of infantry training they would go home on leave and most of them be sent to Vietnam as infantrymen. And here I was going to, I had no idea till later, and I got to researching my aptitude scores, and I had a degree in industrial arts from Chadron State College, and my maintenance scores were really high. So I think that's the reason I got selected to go to Aberdeen, Maryland, to the Aircraft Armament School, which was a 3.5-month school where infantry was 2 months. So I went there, and I graduated in July of '70 from armament school, and then I got my orders for Vietnam. And my brother had told me that when he was over there I wouldn't have to go, but after I got my orders I wasn't going to take that as an excuse. I was going to go put my time in and go to Vietnam. So.
Okay. What did you go to any other schools in the Army?
Well, when I got out of the Army, I enlisted in the National Guard, and I spent 30 years in the National Guard. And so I went through all the NCO schools, I went through battle staff courses. The highest one I went to was the Sergeant Major's Academy, and I retired as a command sergeant major in the National Guard. So yeah, I went to a lot of military schools, but most of them were after Vietnam.
Well, congratulations. That's quite a career.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to Vietnam. So after Aberdeen, what did you go home on leave before you went?
Yeah, well, I'm give you a little history on with
Please.
my wife. She was my sister's roommate, and I didn't know her at all. And in October 1969, my sister called me and she says, "I'd like to have you take my roommate to the homecoming dance." So I says, "Well, Jonah," I says, "I don't have enough money to even buy a flower." My sister says, "Well, I'll buy the flower if you take her." So I did. We went to the homecoming dance, and we went to a football game. Well, then right away we connected. So when I went to basic, I came home 2 weeks, and I saw her then. I went to AIT, and I thought, well, I'm going to ask her to marry me. So when I went to Aberdeen, Maryland, I figured out that people get paid, and if they had KP on the first weekends after they got paid, they would pay you $20 a day. But you know, when you were making $120 a month, $20 is quite little. So I was able to save enough money by pulling KP and my military to buy an engagement ring when I came home from AIT before I went to Vietnam. So that was one of my motivations when I went to AIT. And when I went to AIT, it was aircraft armament school, and it was to learn how to work on armament systems on Cobra and Charlie model helicopters. And we worked on rocket launchers, we worked on the helicopters, miniguns, grenade launchers. So it was a pretty extensive school, a lot of electronics involved, and I was after we got done with school, then we got our orders to where we were going to be sent, and that's when I got my orders for Vietnam.
So you went home and proposed?
Pardon?
You went home and proposed before going to
Yeah,
Vietnam? Is that
I was home, I think, 3 weeks before I went to Vietnam.
Okay.
And so our courtship, basically, we'd known each other less than a year at that time, but so I had enough money that I bought her an engagement ring and asked her to marry me. But I says, I'm not going to get married until after I come back, because if we can make it a year, and if something would happen to me, you know, she wouldn't have that widow title. So we decided to wait, and we got married 6 weeks after I got back from Vietnam. And we've been married 51 years, so I think it's going to work.
You know, one other thing I just thought about, what does AIT stand for? Because this will be looked at years from now.
Advanced Individual Training.
Thank you.
What it was like AIT, Advanced Individual Training. So if you went to basic training, you were taught basic soldiering skills. And then Advanced Individual Training taught you your military occupation skill, which was, in my case, aircraft armament. But you could be infantry, it could be engineering, you know, all the different. So that's how the Army trains you in your military occupation skill.
All right, let's talk about Vietnam. Your time in Vietnam. So once
Okay.
you had to report for Vietnam.
Yeah, Vietnam, when you arrived in country, you arrived at the 90th replacement. And that was where they took all the new people coming into Vietnam, and then they would assign you a company or a place to go. So when I first got there, I was assigned to go to the 101st Airborne, which was up by the north by the DMZ. And my brother told me, he says, go to Red Cross and you can request to be stationed closer to me. So I did that, and as luck would have it, there was probably about 300 or 400 soldiers every morning that would get in this formation. And because I'd asked for this change, well, I was there for like 3 or 4 extra days while all the paperwork got shuffled. And they would pick out 20 people for KP. And every day, out of 400 people, they picked 20. I got picked every day. I was always at the wrong place, and I thought, you know, I had jet lag. It was hot, but anyway, the final they assigned me to the 1st Aviation Brigade, the 12th Group, the 222nd Aviation Battalion, the 195th Assault Helicopter Company. The 195th had Charlie model gunships, which had a crew of 4, and there was 4 of us armors, and we had 8 helicopters that we maintained. But after about 3 weeks in Vietnam, my roommate was from Texas, was a crew chief, and he asked me to fly with him, so I started flying as a door gunner for about once every 4 or 5 days. And those missions entailed inserting infantry, the what we call the slicks, or the H model helicopters that carried troops. We would go in and what they call prep the LZ, a landing zone, and we would go in and fire rockets in and minigun fire into the landing area, and then we'd go back and rearm, and then we would accompany the helicopters that were bringing the troops in, the infantry, and we would circle and give them support if they took fire. And then, so the slicks, we called them, the helicopters would come in, they would come in 3 at a time, they would land, the infantry would go off, they'd go back and pick up their next load, and while we flew support then for the infantry. And then after the insertion, we would often land at a fire support base as a gunship and be support for the infantry, and then they would release us after a certain time after they got established. I did that until about the first part of November.
Please, Helen, yeah.
And we got word that they were going to deactivate the 195th. So,
If you need to take a break, we can, relax for a minute.
yeah. So they, excuse me, they deactivated the 195th, and then I was sent to the 240th Assault Helicopter Company, and I was there just a short time. And one day they asked if anybody could type, and I made a mistake and I raised my hand. So they made me awards and decorations clerk for the 222nd Aviation Battalion. My job was to type a half a page for the battalion commander to sign off on awards. Well, my typing wasn't real good, and I'd get so frustrated because if I got 1 or 2 a day typed perfect, that was accomplishing a lot. And one day the battalion commander came in about end of January of '71, and he says they need school-trained armor in 197th Assault Helicopter Company in Tay Ninh. You want to go? And I says yes, anything to get away from the typewriter. I didn't know where Tay Ninh was, and so I was at my first unit, 195th, was right next to Long Bend, which was pretty close to Saigon. Tay Ninh was north of Saigon, and it was 7 miles from Cambodia. And when I got there, I was informed that the nickname for Tay Ninh was Rocket City. And it was, so I loaded my duffel bag up and went up to Phu Loy to catch a flight to Tay Ninh. And I arrived at Tay Ninh. That night I didn't know a soul, I didn't think, and I happened to run onto a guy that had been at Aberdeen, Maryland at the same time I was, and I recognized him, and he says, "Why don't you come on over tonight? I'll introduce you to some of my buddies." So I go over, and there was, of course, we were sitting on, 3 of us on each bunk. There was 2 bunks in a room, and this one guy takes out paper, and I thought it was a Bull Durham cigarette. And he pours this stuff in, and he rolls it, because I'd seen kids when I was a kid do that. And he lights it and takes a couple of puffs, and I thought, wow, that's a funny smell. And he passes it to the next guy, and then I realized, hey, this is marijuana. So it got to me, and I says, I think I better leave, because I never touched this stuff. I just, and so I got up and left, and I went out I was writing a letter to Lynn, my wife now, my girlfriend then, and I heard this. I thought it was like a jet going over, and it landed, I suppose, about 1,000 meters on the other side of me, and kaboom! And it was a 122 rocket that was shot in. So we really didn't have a lot of incoming the first 6 months I was at Tay Ninh. Mostly we were supporting, our job as an armor was, we'd get up about 4 in the morning and go get the Cobras ready to go out on their missions, make sure all the weapons were ready to go, that type thing, that were on the Cobra helicopters. And then they would take off, usually armed, fully armed with all their weapons, and like a heavy Cobra would carry 38 rockets on the inboard 2 pods, and then 14 on the outboards. And then the minigun was in the nose, and the minigun they could control from the co-pilot, and we called him the Peter pilot, the guy in the front, and the aircraft commander was the one in the back. They were set in for him, and the Cobra was only about this wide, and so they were very maneuverable, a lot of high power in them. And after they would go out on their mission, a lot of times they would call in and say, we need to rearm, and we would go down and help them rearm at the rearm site. So we spent most of our day cleaning the weapons from the day before. We would go through them and make sure they were all, the miniguns were working. We'd clean them, because rust and a lot of moisture in Vietnam, and we really had to oil them down good. And after they fire, well, the oil would burn off and the rust would just set in right away, and so we had to keep them. We made sure the pilots on the Cobras, because there were only 2 pilots, and both of them, usually they were warrant officers or commissioned officers, make sure that they knew how to lubricate those weapons, because after they fire them, most of the lubrication would be off. And so I was the only school trained one there. My NCOIC, which was the non-commissioned officer in charge, was a Spec 5 that was a small arm person, worked on 45 pistols and that type thing, and so by being school trained. Well, then about a month after I got to Tay Ninh, a guy by the name of Dave Matson transferred in, and he had been a gunner like I was in another company that deactivated. So we had two of us that were school trained at that time, and we were able to take care of the weapons and get the Cobras back up to the standard they were supposed to be. And one of the things that when I was in Tainian, we didn't have a PX or any place to get toiletries, that type of thing, and they gave us what they call an SP pack, and once a week they would bring this pack in, and our ration was 1 pack of cigarettes a day, razor blades, toothpaste, all the basic toiletries. And so I was go on parts runs to Fuloi, which is our direct support, where we would get our parts and that type of thing, and I'd take my ration of cigarettes down and trade them for brand new armament parts with the so the Army exchange system sometimes the supply system was maybe not the paperwork but who you knew and how you could. So I had a staff sergeant there that I became friends with, and I'd furnish him cigarettes and he would furnish me with good armament parts. So we'd fly to Fuloi, which was about probably 60 miles from Tainian. One of us armors would fly down once a week, and what they call Asian trace missions, which meant that they were just supply helicopter trips and no combat involved. They would fly at a pretty high altitude, and so I get.
So how long were you in Vietnam total?
I was in Vietnam for a year and 17 days. They had a program that if you had less than 5 months left when you got out of Vietnam, you could get out of the Army. So I'd extend for 17 days to get down under 5 months, and then I could get out. But everything was pretty good at Tainian until July 27th of 1971. It was my brother's birthday, and I'll remember it. But the two sappers and a sapper, S-A-P-P-E-R, they would come in through the wire, and the only thing they wore was kind of a jock strap and C4 charges on their back in a backpack. And those C charges, they were trained to put those charges on the fuel tank of a helicopter, pull the firing pin, and that would explode and get into the fuel tank and burn up the helicopter. Well, two of them got into our maintenance area, and the interior guard killed one of them, and he was right about 20 feet in front of our armament shop. And of course he laid there for a couple days till the EOD team came to disarm him, and then they could take the body away. But that morning after that happened, well, the other one took off running, and the guard was sure that he shot him. So that next morning we had to sweep this area, and I happened to be on that group that were sweeping the areas. We all had our M16 rifles, and I'll never forget, because about probably 50 yards ahead of me I saw the grass start moving, and so I hollered at the sergeant of the guard. He came up, and we watched it for a while. Well, it was a dog. But we did find the other one. He in Vietnam, what we called a pisser. It was a 55-gallon drum that was buried in the ground, and it had holes punched in it, and soldiers would urinate in that. Well, the 25th Infantry had deactivated a couple years before, or a year before, and that was abandoned area. Well, this guy had crawled down into one of those pissers and bled to death and died. So both of them were killed, but they did get two of our helicopters. And luckily the interior guard realized what was going on, and or they could have got a lot more of them. So what they did then is we were close to being deactivated or moved. So they decided that they would move us back to a place called Dion. Well, they left about 20 of us back at Tain Inn with about 5 deuce and a half trucks. And our first sergeant to move us, and basically what we did is load up wall lockers. And that night we had incoming all night. It was really scary. So I went on guard duty that night, and I happened to be down on the flight line, and we had a fire station there, and we had a guard tower that was above the fire station. And I went on guard duty that night with this guy, and he takes a cigarette, pulls out the tobacco, pours this white stuff in, puts the tobacco in and smokes it, and he catches the ashes. He takes another cigarette, puts that in, and I says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm warming up." I had no concept at all what he was doing. And then he licks his finger, pours this white stuff on, and goes, snorts it. Well, after a while, he was, so I called the sergeant of the guard and told him, I says, we have a guy here that I'm sure is OD'd. So I says, I'm down on the flight line. We're only about probably half a mile from the perimeter of Tain Inn base camp. So I told him I want enough pop flares. They were little handheld flares, and they would run about probably 10 minutes. I says, I need enough. I'm going to keep this lit up all night because I'm down here by myself. And so he brought me down a lot of pop flares. That was probably the scariest night of my life. Was I was worried about the Viet Cong coming across, because at that point the South Vietnamese Army was our guard for our perimeter, and then we carried the interior guard. Well, this guy, they took him away then, and I never saw him again. But so that was pretty scary. Well, so then that next day we told the first sergeant, we got to have some air support up here. So they brought two Cobras up, gunships, and when they would fly, nothing would happen. But as soon as they'd land or refuel or rearm or whatever, the incoming would start again. Well, this went on 2 more nights, and finally they loaded us. We had all the trucks loaded with wall lockers, and we headed to Zion, which is over by Saigon, Long Binh area, more secure area. And so we were the last people to leave, Americans to leave Tain Inn base camp.
And that was when?
That would have been in about the 1st of August of '71. So then I only had about 6 weeks left in country then when I went to Zion and finished out my Vietnam time in Zion. But the first sergeant was leaving Vietnam the same time I was, and about 4 or 5 others from our unit. So he knew all the ropes of, being a E8, a lot higher ranking than the rest of us. And so he just says, well, come on, I'll show you how to process out and get on the plane and all that. So he was a real motivator for us. But Vietnam was the drug problem that I saw was terrible. The guys could walk out on the perimeter and go next to the South Vietnamese Army, or the ARVNs, and put up 1 or 2 fingers, and as I recall, one was marijuana, 2 was heroin, and for a little price, and I really think that was big start of a drug problem even carried over to the United States because, you know, most of the Vietnam veterans were only 19 years old or thereabouts and were very easily influenced, and so it was a big problem over there. And when I was in the 195th, one night I heard a explosion and didn't think much of it because it's quite a ways away. Well, it turned out that it was our first sergeant had a kind of a billets that had 2 rooms, had kind of a little living area and had a bedroom. Well, he fell asleep on the couch that night and somebody threw a frag grenade between his bed and the sandbags that were surrounded it. And luckily he took some shrapnel, but he lived, you know, didn't get hurt very bad. Well, in 1983, I think it was, a bunch of us from western Nebraska went to the dedication of the statue of the 3 fighting men. And I put my name on Find a Vet, and I put on that I was in the 195th and the 187th. And I get a letter from a guy, and we wrote back and forth 2 or 3 times, and my civilian career, I was a banker, and there was a guy from Kansas that worked at the bank with me, and I says, "What's this Lansing, Kansas?" "Well, that's Kansas State Penitentiary." Here I'd been communicating with this guy, and he was in the same platoon as I was in Vietnam, so we hit it off, you know, because and our platoon was called the Thunder Chickens. And so I wrote to him and I says, "Well, I figured out you're in prison." And he wrote me back and says, "Well," he says, "I was dating a gal and I beat her up in Kansas, and I got out on bail and I skipped bail and went to Oregon, and then I got caught doing something there, and so they shipped me back." Anyway, he says, "Remember the guy that fragged the first sergeant? He'd like to have somebody write to him." My wife says, "Oh, it's time to shut this off," you know, and then, so I did, because we were afraid that if once he got out, he'd probably come to me and want. But anyway, that was a big problem with the druggies there was, and the senior enlisted senior officers or officers were concerned about being fragged, you know, because if they tried to bust them, well, you know, those guys get high on drugs and they do things that so that was a big problem within the military. So then on September 3rd, I came home from Vietnam. I swore I'd never put a green uniform on again. And 6 weeks later I got married in the middle of October of '71 and settled in a little town of Hay Springs, Nebraska. That's where I was raised and graduated from high school there. And I was only 20 miles from Chadron, northwest Nebraska, and I worked for a mental retardation program for 2.5 years, and the local banker asked me to go to work for him, and so I spent 40 years in the banking career, and then I also joined the National Guard in '73 and till 2002, and I was mostly in artillery in the National Guard, and ended up with the 67th Infantry Brigade in Nebraska National Guard as a Command Sergeant Major. So I really enjoyed the military after I got back into it, but I was a little burned out when I came back from Vietnam, which I think a lot of people were, you know.
So how long between your return and joining the National Guard?
It was about not quite 2 years.
Oh, so not very long.
Yeah. Back then they had what they call a Try-One program for the National Guard, where you could sign up for 1 year, And so I did that. Then I signed up for 3 years, and then pretty soon I had like 5 years in, and I thought, boy, you know, it's I'm a fourth of the way to retirement. And in the National Guard, your retirement doesn't start till you're age 60, but you know, it covers TRICARE, which is your health insurance. You get your retirement, and so it was a good move, because retirement is pretty nice to have. And I've been retired for 14 years now, so I'm 74, and it's been nice supplemental income. But the big thing about the National Guard was that Nebraska has like 75% tuition that the state pays, and then you get the GI Bill, you get your government or your National Guard pay. So I always said that, you know, Nebraska or National Guard could offer pretty comparable scholarship that the University of Nebraska could offer football players, because you know, GI Bill and 3/4 of your tuition paid, and pay, and
Does any of that go to your children or just to you?
just to be. But when I had to buy it's annuity that if I died before my wife, the annuity would keep paying, but so they take so much out a month for that. But if she dies before me, well then I don't need that annuity anymore, but I want to protect her. So.
Do you still keep in touch with any of your Vietnam friends?
Yes, I do. I've got two. One of them lives in San Diego, and he was at Tainan with me. He was a tech supply, and he retired as a engineer for a company that contracted with the military, developing missiles, that type thing. And another one lives in central Minnesota, and he was an armor with me, and I kept close contact with him. We text each other probably once a month, and I've been to his place a couple times. He's stopped, spent some time with us, and got to be pretty good friends. And
Have you ever gone to a military reunion for any with
yeah.
your Vietnam units?
Yeah, the 187th has really a neat website. If you go to 187th Assault Helicopter Company, and it's the person that put it together was awarded to having one of the best websites of any military. And anyway, they have a annual reunion. I've gone to 2 of them, and it's pretty neat, because you meet people or see people you haven't seen for a long time. And one of them was in San Diego, and the other one I went to was in St. Louis, and they kind of rotate different places, and different people sponsor them. But they're really quite emotional, because you know, we have a memorial service. There was in the 187th Assault Company, there was 43 people killed, either killed in action or through crashes. And the 2 that I knew, Sergeant Campos and Sergeant Kulacek, were flying in the same helicopter, and they had a mid-air collision with another helicopter. This would have been in October of '71, about a month after I'd left. But they were both at my party when I was leaving Vietnam, and their platoon sergeant was from Hyannis, Nebraska. His name was Ben Simpson, or is Ben Simpson. And Ben and I kept in contact, but Ben and I got to be friends because Nebraska, a little story about Nebraska football. I was at Bearcat, Vietnam, when I was awarded the decorations clerk, and I was out on guard duty the night of 1st of January 1971, and Nebraska was number 3 in the ratings, and I snuck a little radio with a earplug out on guard duty that night, and I listened to all 3 of those games, and the first 2 teams that were rated number 1 and 2 got beat. And my roommate was from Texas, and Texas was number 1 that year. And the 3rd game Nebraska played, and Nebraska won. So I came back, I didn't say a thing to my roommate. But then the Stars and Stripes come out saying Nebraska number 1, you know, rated and all this. So I cut those out and I mailed them to him. And one day, and I didn't put who it was from, and he said, "Damn you, Terrell." So that was how how Nebraska. Anyway, I wrote Nebraska number 1. I had it embroidered on the back of my hat. And I was flying to Fuloy one day on maintenance, and the crew chief came up to me and he says, "You from Nebraska?" I says, "Yeah." I says, "I'm from up by Chadron." And he says, "Oh, I went to school at Chadron State for a year." And I says, "Well, I just went there 4 years." And you know, Chadron State's a small college, only has about 3,000. So we got acquainted, and then we started spending time together. Well, then I spent a lot of time with his unit, and that's how I got acquainted with his Sergeant Kudlicek and Campos. But Sergeant Kudlicek was from Valparaiso, Nebraska, and I moved to Bellevue in 2008. And then it just happened to be on the front page of the World Herald. They had these flights of World War II veterans going back to Washington, D.C. Well, here was a Eldon Kudlicek Sr. that they featured on the front page of the World Herald. And when I started reading the article, it was because his son was killed in Vietnam. I thought, well, that's the Edwin I know. So I was hauling stuff back from Cozad, Nebraska to Bellevue when we moved here. And so I thought, I'm going to stop, because I found out where Edwin Kudlicek Sr. lived. And I stopped, and he was gone, but his mother, or his wife, was there, which was the mother of Edwin. And I had, you know, like this annual book and a few other things that I had that I'd taken up with me. And, you know, first of all, she was a little standoffish, and then after I could show her some stuff that she says, "Well, come in." And we had the best visit, because I had seen her son alive since she had, and she had memorabilia. I had some stuff, you know, like the pictures and the annual and stuff like that, and she gave me a big hug when I left, and so that was really pretty neat. So,
Would you explain where you got that book? That a little bit about that book? 'Cause not everybody has one like that.
This is kind of like an annual that was put together, but we had a group of.
You got some pictures falling out of the book. I just.
Oh, this one?
No, the one you were holding.
Oh,
I just.
yeah. This came. We had some Koreans that came in and took a bunch of pictures and that type of thing, kind of like a high school yearbook. And I can't remember, it was like $10. And so they published this yearbook, and it had a lot of information about our unit and pictures from different units or platoons in the company, and it's something I've really treasured, because it's got pictures of most everybody that was in the unit and pictures of the different sections and
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
we've not
So-
seen one like that before. So.
yeah. So
And that book that you're. Would
Yeah.
you know that one? Would you hold it up? I
Yeah.
mean, would it?
this in March of 2012, Gary McCormick is a retired colonel, and he was a battalion commander of the 1st of the 168th Field Artillery in Nebraska Guard. And he was a sergeant, and he was an infantry soldier with the Brigade 1 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, and was pretty much in the same area that I was. And so we got to talking one day, and he says, let's go back to Vietnam. So in 2012, we hooked up with a lady that was from Vietnam, had married a U.S. soldier, and she organized these trips. Well, we had a tour guide and a driver, you know. So there was only 4 of us in the vehicle, and it was really pretty cheap way to do it, but it was really neat because we could go to places that we wanted to go. Well, Gary was in the infantry, and he had a map of different battles. He had kept his military map and had designated where the maps are. So, taking our driver, which was this guy, was the driver, or the guide, he took us right to the place where Gary had had a battle, and showed us, you know, Gary explained, well, we were over here, the friendlies, the Viet Cong were over here, and it wasn't too far from Cu Chi. And also pointed out where the medevacs took out their wounded and all this type of stuff. But really interesting. But we went to Tay Ninh military base. They wouldn't let us in because it was the Vietnam people made it a military base, so they wouldn't let civilians in. But this is my picture showing Tay Ninh.
Can you hold it up a little more, because yeah, that's better, thank you. There was a glare when you held it sideways.
This was when if you've heard of the Cu Chi tunnels, these tunnels extended into this mountain, Nui Bai Dien, that was pretty close to where we were, where the Viet Cong controlled the mountain. But the highlight of this trip was, this is a Viet Cong colonel, this was a Viet Cong captain, and it was really neat because 40 years earlier we were trying to kill each other, and now we're sitting down having dinner together. This lady ran a restaurant, and of course chicken was their main food. And one thing we saw over there was chickens ran wild everywhere. Well, they don't have refrigeration, so they can kill a chicken, eat it the same day, and a lot of small animals were, you know, here we have big 1,000-pound critters that we can freeze, but they don't have that over there, so but they gave us this friendship medal, which is a Ho Chi Minh medal. And Ho Chi Minh was the commander of North Vietnam when we were fighting them, and I mixed emotions there, but that was really a neat trip. Then we went to North Vietnam, Hanoi, and we visited the Hanoi Hilton, where the POWs were held. And that was very interesting because on the wall they had pictures of U.S. military playing volleyball and having a banquet, and they were called their guests. Well, we all know they were far from being guests, but they were. It was very interesting just to see the sails and the place where our POWs were kept, and then we were at Haiphong Harbor area where the first encounter of Vietnam took place, and it's off the coast of Hanoi there, North Vietnam, and so it was really a neat trip to go back. And
how long were you there?
10 days. We were about, I think, 6 days in what would have been South Vietnam, and then This is this is what a mountain. The Americans called it the Black Virgin Mountain. And this was only about, I think, about 7 miles from Tay Ninh. And it's also called, the Vietnamese name was Nguyen Bai Dien. And they always told us that we controlled the top, which was the communications for most of the southern part of Vietnam. And then we controlled the ground around it, but the Viet Cong actually had hospitals and things like that dug in, and that was part of the Cu Chi Tunnel complex. Because that was probably about 10 miles from, maybe 15 from Cu Chi. I'm not sure how far, but so.
Was there something in that book you wanted to talk about?
I kept a scrapbook when I was there, and this this is kind of a funny story. My brother came over, he was in Vietnam at the same time, and he came over, and I'd only been there 3 weeks at the time, and he says, this Jim graduated from Hay Springs High School too. He says, let's go see Jim, I know where he is. And of course my brother had been there about a year and a half at the time, so he knew his way around. So we go to this other compound, we find Jim, and that afternoon we were playing horseshoe with his first sergeant, 4 of us, and so we got acquainted with this first sergeant. Well, 6 o'clock came, and the gates closed, and of course I was pretty green. I didn't know anything about this, and Jim says, "Oh heck, we got to get you back." This guy, the other guy from Hay Springs, and he had been there about 9 months at the time, and he's a character, and so he goes down the motor pool and gets a vehicle. Well, the way they secure vehicles in Vietnam, or even today, is they tie a chain around the steering wheel, to the floor and put a padlock on it. Well, of course, he couldn't check it out, so he took bolt cutters and he cut the padlock off. So we go up the first MP gate, and they ask for his logbook, and he says, "Oh heck, I forgot it." So we back up. He says, "Oh, there's another MP gate. We'll go up there." And so we went up there, but I think the first gate had called the second gate. So they asked for his logbook, and so they arrested us. So we were sitting in this chicken wire holding jail. And this Jim says, "Call my first sergeant." And so they finally got a hold of him, and his first sergeant come over and he says, "Oh, these are good guys. They were just trying to get him back and all that." Well, then I had to call my company to have the officer of the day come and get me, and I thought, boy, I'm really going to be in trouble. Well, it just happened that I'd flown one mission as a door gunner, and it happened to be the co-pilot that was the officer of the day that night. And he picked me up with his driver and in a Jeep, and we headed back, and he says, "I don't know anything about this if you don't." So, but I was pretty scared because, of course, my brother, he'd been there long enough to know the ropes. He just stayed with Jim that night and got up early the next morning and went back to his area. But he worked out the docks of Saigon and lived in Long Binh, which is about 12 miles. And every day they bust him back and forth. And so.
What unit was he with?
He was a first log, which was a transportation unit. That
Army also?
Yeah,
okay.
Army, yeah. So they unloaded ships, and mostly it was kind of interesting because the Saigon River is what they came up to Saigon with the ships, but they had to come up when the tide was up in order to have enough water to bring these big ships up. And I went over and visited him one day, and they were pretty good sized ships. They were kind of but once the tide would go out, there wasn't enough water in the river to. But when I was flying as a door gunner, we would fly at the mouth of the Saigon River, and when the tide was out, there's all kinds of bay area that was exposed, and then when the tide came up, it covered a lot of that area with water. And well, the guy I flew with is Dale James. He was a crew chief, but man, he had an eye like a hawk, and he could see stuff, and he would see a bunker or something, and he'd point it out, and I'd look. But my first mission, flying as a door gunner, we were in support of some infantry, and there was a banana tree area where they planted banana trees, and we made our gun runs in, and I was on the left side, so as the helicopter comes in, I could fire, but then as it banks, I'm looking up in the sky, and the crew chief is looking down, he's still firing, and then we come around again, and so we expended all of our ammo and stuff, and we were headed back, and he says, "Did you see those tracers coming up at us?" I said, "Nope." That was my first experience of taking fire or being shot at, and then a lot of our missions were, we had what we call a sniffer mission, and one helicopter, a H model or a slick, would fly at treetop level, and they had sensors on them that would sense sort of like smoke, human ammonia, that type of thing, and they could sense where if there was people in the area. Well, it would be what they call a free fire zone. There shouldn't be anybody in that area, friendlies. So we would have this helicopter flying treetop level. We were up here with a gunship, and we were supporting them in case they took fire. Well, then, if they got a positive reading, we would leave. They would call artillery in and shoot into that area. And that was called a sniffer mission. And then one mission we had was training South Vietnam infantry soldiers. So we would simulate, the H models coming in with the infantry, how they got off the helicopters, and then we would fly support just for training. So that was kind of interesting because they could carry about 2 more infantry, South Vietnamese infantry soldiers, because they were so small. They were little guys, they didn't weigh much. And I remember the H models would carry 8 to 10 American soldiers and 12, and then they had a gunner and a door gunner, and then the 2 pilots. So
Is there something significant you think you've gained from your experience in Vietnam? A lesson you learned, a feeling? I don't know if that's a way to describe it.
yeah. One of the things,
I mean, I know that could be an hour conversation.
Yeah.
But
when I was a junior in high school, I went to a church meeting or camp one summer, and I happened to write down, this guy's preacher wanted us to write 2 goals in life. And my goal at that time, and I just completed a communism course in high school, and I put down, I want to go to Vietnam to fight communism, and after I get my education. And so I graduated from college, and I'm a religious person, and I believe that we needed to stand up to communism, because communism is not a very good way to live for people. And so that was one of my commitments that I had made to myself. And then one other thing while I'm thinking about it, the guide that took us around, his wife was a insurance agent in Saigon before the fall of Vietnam. She had to go through the re-education camp, and he took us to a dam that was built pretty close to this Nui by Din, that mountain. And if you look on a map now, it covers a pretty big area, like right here in this map is that dam. And it wasn't there when we were there before. And he said that was built by a pick, a shovel, and wheelbarrows. And it was about 7 miles long. It wasn't real deep. And the only concrete they had is on the spillway and a lot of irrigation systems that they built. But he says she had 6 months of physical labor to learn how to work and 6 months of communism indoctrination. The only thing I really didn't understand, the advisor was he said he was the first Cav interpreter, 1st Cavalry Division for the American Army. Why he didn't go through, so I'm not sure his story was all true, but anyway, he said that, and I know that after the fall of Vietnam, they did have those re-education camps, and they were pretty brutal, and a lot of people didn't survive it because they, if you weren't physically able, they didn't want you. So, but what I learned in Vietnam was a lot about myself, how I would react to different things. When we had the deal in Tay Ninh, I was scared, and when the sappers came in, they moved the helicopters out. We had incoming so strong that night because we were only basically 7 miles from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and so it wasn't hard for them to get a lot of those munitions into Vietnam. And I never one of the things that being a career military person also in the National Guard, I could never figure why you let the battle come to us. Why don't you go to the battle? And the Ho Chi Minh Trail was their way of bringing armament down to South Vietnam. Why didn't we take that out? We had the capabilities of doing it. Why weren't we in North Vietnam? The tactics, because a lot of times, I saw 2 or 3 times where we would go insert infantry troops into one area, they would secure it, we'd pull them out, and 2 months later we'd be doing the same thing. The logic just didn't seem right to me a lot of times, but I think it helped me be a better soldier when I was later, understanding that a lot of tough decisions have to be made. It's like now with the Russian deal. What do we do? There's tough, because decisions you make today are going to affect people for years to come. And I guess I was supportive of Vietnam at the time because I thought we needed to defeat communism. And I had an advantage too. I was 22 when I went because I'd gone through college, and most of the guys I worked with were 19, 18, 19, mostly 19-year-olds or 20-year-olds. And you look now, I've got a grandson that's 20, and I'd hate to have him have to go through that. That's such a young, tender age, but one thing about it, young people are good soldiers because they think they're indestructible until they get into it, and all of a sudden reality sets in.
Yeah, speaking of grandsons, have you spoken to your family about your Vietnam experience?
Pardon?
Have you spoken to any of your family members about your Vietnam experience?
Oh, yeah.
Any of your children or grandchildren?
Yeah, I wrote a kind of a biography of my Vietnam. It's 10 pages, and I've been reluctant to share it because I thought it would be something that I would be shared after I'm gone.
Did you show it to your wife? Have you shown it to your wife?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. She knows I've written it, but the only person that I've let read it is my sister because she's a English major school teacher. But this is one of the Charlie model helicopters that are flew on. This is the crew chief on this side, and I flew on the other side. These are rocket pods here, and each one of them carried 19 rockets. And that's what I worked on these Charlie model helicopters. And then this was a Charlie model with miniguns. It had 7 rockets on each side, and then it had the miniguns, and those miniguns would fire 3,000 to 4,000 rounds a minute, but they only had a 3-second burst limit, because if they fired more than that time, they would melt the barrels, so to speak. And that's, we usually flew as a team, and then the H models, or the slicks we called them, were the ones that inserted the troops. So that's, but I was pretty lucky to be a aircraft armament, not an infantryman, and I really enjoyed that type of work. But and basically, I thinking, you know, we were working on killing machines.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, or that you'd like to say for posterity about Vietnam or your military experience, or the war itself?
I just think our country has to maintain its strength through the military. And if we don't have people that are willing to step up and serve, and the all-voluntary army, I think, I really questioned whether it was going to work when they started it, but it's been pretty successful, our all-volunteer military. We have a lot of young people that are stepping up. I think if we ever got into a major battle again, we'd have to reinstate the draft, and you know, I'm glad I spent my 32 years involved with the military. It was very rewarding. I did a lot of traveling. I spent time in Germany with the National Guard on warfighter exercises, and I went to a corps which is commanded by a 3-star general, and our division commander was General Casey. And General Casey at that time was the 1st Armor Division commander, and he ended up being the Army Joint, or represented the Army in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But I was a liaison officer to the 5th Panzer Division, so I lived with the German Army for 2 weeks. And that was an experience. I kind of got tired of German food, but you know, most of them spoke English. And then I had to go once a day and give a report to General Casey. And I remember the first day, I'd never done this before, and I said, "Sir, you're going to have to bear with me because I've never done this and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing." He says, "Well, we're here to learn." And he was very helpful. I was really impressed with him. And then the Command Sergeant Major at that time that we worked with was General Casey's Command Sergeant Major in the division, and he became the Sergeant Major of the Army. So it kind of makes it a small world when you work with somebody that became Sergeant Major of the Army and represent the Army and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so it's been a neat career. It's met a lot of people. Our National Guard won an award for being the best supply section in the National Guard, and so they sent a bunch of us back to Washington, D.C., and just happened to be the General Shinseki, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army at that time, came and walked around. I got to shake his hand, and you know, it just kind of makes you realize that they're just human too, you know, and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to be good leaders, and to get that high up. So I had some really neat experiences in the military. And I guess what I want to say, I appreciate doing this, and I hope that history can look at these things and that we gain from our past experiences. And I want to extend my appreciation to you two and for being able to do this.
Thank you. for your service,
Yeah.
Vietnam, otherwise, and for the interview. I'm gonna
Okay.
cut it off.
Okay, thank you.